one of the great paradoxes of Virginia politics. Virginia politicians are always moaning and groaning about the fiscal excesses of the federal government. But those same politicians yowl and scream if their slice of the federal budgetary pie is in danger of shrinking or disappearing altogether. It's another example of old Virginia versus new Virginia. In old Virginia, government living within its means was an article of faith. The state never spent more than it took in. In fact, that fiscal discipline is required by law. If cash runs short and the budget's out of balance, the governor and the legislature have to make sure receipts and expenses always match up. That could require spending cuts, and more often than not, that's the preferred course. Tax increases are another option, but the politicians, even the biggest tax and spend types, tend to be pretty careful about hitting up taxpayers for more money, especially during tight times. There's another important reason, one rooted in history, for Virginia's legendary fiscal discipline. When this state was controlled by a conservative, white, largely rural oligarchy, and that was the case until the mid-1960s, politicos didn't want Virginia spending too much on basic services. That was because if people were better educated, healthier, if it was easier for them to get around, they would be better informed, perhaps more active politically. The establishment wasn't going to stand for that, especially if it threatened the establishment's power. And if state government was going to be tight with a buck, there was no reason why the federal government shouldn't follow suit. But then there's the accident of geography. Virginia is hard by the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. As the federal government has grown, so too has Virginia. The Second World War helped put in place the outlines of the suburban-dominated state, the new Virginia we know today. That's meant lots and lots of federal jobs, military and civilian. Virginia politicians like that because working voters tend to be loyal to the elective officials who work at keeping them working. This also means that the political class is less inclined to complain about excessive federal spending. Indeed, they prefer to think of it as federal largesse. The problem this has created is that Virginia is over-dependent on its rich Uncle Sam on the other side of the Potomac, and, depending whose math you prefer, federal spending, direct and indirect, accounts for about 30% of the state's economy. When that spending contracts, Virginia's fiscal problems expand. For example, during the McAuliffe governorship, across-the-board spending cuts meant that it took longer for Virginia's economy to recover. Reducing the size of the federal government is among the goals of a second Trump presidency. That's a turn-on for core Republican voters, and it's part of Project 2025, that conservative manifesto drafted by anti-government Republicans, including those who've worked for Donald Trump. Trump's trying to distance himself from Project 2025 because he knows it's making voters, mostly swing voters, nervous about what the government will do or do to them if Trump is restored to the presidency. A big fear that under Trump, thousands of them, maybe hundreds of thousands of them, will lose their jobs. But Governor Youngkin, a Republican who's now full-on MAGA because his political future could depend on it, is telling Virginians who work for the federal government that they have nothing to worry about. According to a report by Radio IQ, Youngkin says Virginia, having snatched back its distinction as the best state for business, has plenty of jobs that out-of-work bureaucrats would soon be back at work. Is that supposed to be damage control? Or is Youngkin merely inflicting damage? It wouldn't be the first time. Remember that intense competition between Maryland and Virginia for the new FBI headquarters? Virginia was confident the state would get it because all of the Bureau's other important offices are in the northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. The Biden administration picked Maryland. And though that selection remains in dispute, it's difficult to imagine the administration opted for Maryland in part because it was ticked off that Youngkin attacked, as a political stunt, the FBI raid to collect those secret documents at Trump's estate in Florida. That decision, if it stands, will cost Virginia at least 7,500 jobs. But no surprise, you don't hear Youngkin talking about that. For the Richmond Times-Dispatch, this is Jeff Shapiro.